Thank you, Philip. Thank you so much for letting me participate in this today. It's exciting to see all the different people that are participating and where you're coming from. I wanted to just start off with a little bit of perspective. When we focus on this concept of watersheds in Chicago, we have a unique situation in that in the 1880s, the state converted, or reversed, I guess I should say, reversed the river, the Chicago River. It used to drain into Lake Michigan, and there was so much pollution and effluent going into the lake, and it was the drinking water source, that they actually reversed the river to have it flow and go into the Mississippi River, which significantly changed the shape of our watershed when you look at the Lake Michigan watershed for us. However, we still have a watershed based on the river itself. It's just slightly different than what it was originally. And then, interestingly enough, about 100 years later, in 1987, we had this situation that happened in Chicago where an actor from Los Angeles moved to the northeastern Illinois, to a little community called Lake Forest, and he immediately purchased a property and cut down 150 mature old oak trees, eliminating all the trees on his property, which, as you can imagine, let out a cry across the entire region as to how do we stop this. And this is where many of our ordinances really began to get strengthened in our area. I also wanted to give just a little background for how we work across our region and how we address some of these challenges, in that we've identified priority areas. And I provided the link to this map here for you, and I'll be referring to these priority maps as I go through my little presentation here this afternoon. And what we've identified in the priority areas are areas where we have increased flooding, poor air quality, vulnerable populations, increased heat, and some of those challenges that are, unique to urban living. But we cover 284 municipalities in the Chicago region and 50 wards in the city of Chicago. And all of those are identified individually on these priority maps. And then we also cover outreach and education around management plans and ordinances across the state of Illinois through the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. So we have a broad scope that we try to provide outreach to, and as you can imagine, a broad scale going from Chicago of about 8.4 million people down to communities of just a few thousand people. So Karen has introduced a lot of the concepts behind ordinances and codes already, but what I want to really get across from our perspective is that we look at as an ordinance as a box, a toolbox, if you will, where all these different little aspects that we rely on in our community, the tools, are the sections within those ordinances. And some of those ordinances will have very specific information, and some of our tools will be outside the ordinance. It may be a management plan or other policy, such as a watershed ordinance or something like that that might be controlled by the county. So when we look at different kinds of ordinances, I think it's important to remember that within those individual ordinances and those, across the entire code, almost always there's something in that section of the code that has something that relates to trees. And so, therefore, oftentimes you'll see information and regulations around trees that are spread throughout the code. And the nice thing is that now we're able to, in most instances, go online and search, because those ordinances are recorded electronically now, so that you can hunt for trees or forestry to identify some areas of those codes that could potentially be relevant to what you're doing. But this can sometimes be challenging for developers and contractors who are working across your community to identify what specific things that they need to be focused on. One of the things that we're really focused on is that trees are infrastructure. They're like roads and sewers and water lines. We just did a regional workshop with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, who's one of our lead partners, to communicate to, we had about 65 communities in attendance at this meeting, to communicate the value and importance of trees in ordinances and in management strategies so that we can preserve and protect them just like we do our other infrastructure. And one of the challenges, obviously, is getting them placed in the code in such a way that they can be protected and preserved, but also have resources allocated for their preservation. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. We do a capacity survey every few years. We're actually in the process of updating that right now. So we send a survey out. It has about 80 questions that asks are different communities, what their level of professionalism is, meaning do they have a certified arborist on staff who maintains the trees in their community, what types of ordinances they have, if they have a management plan, how many dollars are allocated to forestry, if they have an inventory, pruning. There's a whole range of questions, but it enables us to utilize that information to direct our resources and outreach to assist those communities that might need specific assistance and gives us a clear view of what they need. And when that's combined with the prioritization map that we talked about at the beginning of my presentation, it provides a very clear picture of what some of the challenges are across our communities and how we have different disparities that we need to address. One of the things that we have done early on is we developed ordinance templates, and there are 3 levels of templates. There's a bronze, silver, and gold. The bronze is a template that's based on public property tree regulation only, and it assumes that there is no management in place, a management plan in place within the community. So a lot of the specifics in that ordinance are within the ordinance. It doesn't have anything that it can utilize as a support piece. When you go to the silver level ordinance, that ordinance is based on a management plan, and when it's based on a management plan, it gives the community the flexibility to be able to go in and make changes and updates to the management plan without having to go back in and redo the entire ordinance. So a lot of the detail that is in the bronze ordinance is now able to go into the management plan, which can be an active, vital document that the community can rely on. And then the third one is the gold level ordinance, which regulates trees on public and private land and is also based on a management plan. So when we look at the specific tools that might be in a tree preservation ordinance, there are many different categories that a community would look at, and some of these are identified here. But all of those categories can also be included in an urban forest management plan, again, that can be this support base. But what's really important is to be sure to define very early and very clearly what the purpose of that section of the ordinance is and why it's in place. And then to very clearly define what those specific terms are so that it's easy for a developer, a contractor, a resident, or any other person that's going into the ordinance to be able to figure out easily and clearly why you have it and what is contained within that ordinance. We've developed a template that is for management plans. Again, we believe they're really important to have your ordinance based on a management plan. And our template was built around the Sustainable Urban Forest step-by-step approach that was developed by Michael Leff, the U.S. Forest Service, and Davey Institute. It's a great guide if you can get to that on the internet, and I'd be glad to provide a direct link if you need it. But that provides, clearly what it states, a step-by-step guide for getting an urban forestry plan up and running within your community. And our ordinance template pulls different sections from that so that a community can go in based on where they are and select specific sections to inform the practices they currently have, but also provide some incentives and opportunities to look ahead and see what they could more fully do to more accurately and adequately manage their urban forest. Obviously, for any ordinance, any management plan, an inventory is critical in a community to understand what they're managing and how they're managing it. We find that many communities do not have an inventory, and so we've been able to provide information to them on our interactive map called our Forest Canopy Summaries. So for each of the 284 municipalities, we have a canopy summary packet, and this is for the city of Chicago. So for instance, it shows them what the greatest land use they have in Chicago is, and that's transportation, followed second by residential. And where is the most potential for increased planting? Where are trees currently the greatest in percentage? And so in Chicago, it's along these transportation corridors, but the opportunity areas are in residential. So that would be an indicator to that community that they need to focus on educating and engaging their residents. And this, again, can be brought up and founded in their management plan. It also includes information on canopy cover, and so in the city of Chicago, and this was based on a census that we did in 2010, and the city of Chicago had done one in 2007, and at that time we found that there was 19% canopy. Now since 2010, in the Chicago region, we've lost 13 million ash trees, and so we believe that canopy is now closer to 17%, which is quite low for a metropolitan area. Regionally, our canopy is 18% now from what it was in 2010, and we're just in the process right now of updating that census. That'll begin in June of this year. And then importantly for any community to improve their management strategies is to identify what the value of that forest is. So when you're arguing or you're presenting your case to your elected officials, it's often helpful to show what the value and the benefits that those trees provide. And the iTree suite of resources is terrific for that. And you can get to that based on your species composition as well as your canopy cover, and we've provided that for the City of Chicago. And then species composition, as I mentioned, because many communities or cities don't have inventories, Chicago does a stratified sample for an inventory. What we find here is that they have 15% maple and 8% or 11% ash, or at least in 2010 they did. So, and their species diversity is very low. What we know regionally is that 20% of all the street trees in the Chicago region were ash, and those are all gone now. And 32% of the street trees are maple. And so we can learn from just looking at that information that can inform our ordinances and our management plans on expanding species diversity and encouraging increased diversification of our urban forests. And that can also be something important to include in our ordinance and in our management plan so that we're keeping on track and making sure we're reaching the goals that we need. We find when we review ordinances for municipalities that there's almost always a species list that's identified in that ordinance, and many times it's 10 or 15 years old because that's the last time the ordinance was completely updated. We recommend that, again, you base this information in your management plan, and then the management plan can reference a site that updates, that has experts on it that update for your region or your area a species list frequently. And then you can personalize that species list to utilize in your tree plantings when you go out to do increased tree plantings in your community. So for instance, we recommend that you not plant more than 5% of any one species at any given time. And that, again, is this goal to increase our species diversity across the region. Our resource that we have is set up so that it helps communities and landowners that may not know species or how to do to select them. And so it's a selector tool that asks them a series of questions and then gives them species they can choose from. Uh-oh, there we go. Do I get it? What happened? I think I'm in the wrong sec. There we go. Sorry, my little cursor was over. A resource that we also utilize for management plans is the Tree Owner's Manual. This is a guide that was developed by the U.S. Forest Service. It's available free online. We actually have them printed. They're available in English and Spanish both. And because we understand and realize the significance of private property trees, especially for us, that's 70% of all the trees that we have in the Chicago region, it's an easy resource to hand out to residents as well as direct them to online. But it's also basic information that could be incorporated into a management plan and make sure that it's covered in your ordinance. There are fact sheets available on basic tree planting and mulching. This is just a simple cut sheet that you can put into a specification or reference in your management plan or in your ordinance, or even provide for residents and contractors that work within your community. Invasive species is a hot topic issue for us, having just come off of emerald ash borer, as I mentioned. We're also finding we have significant challenges with some invasive species, specifically buckthorn and honeysuckle for us that are 30% of all of our trees. But calorie pear is becoming much more of a significant issue. And those are things that can easily be identified and written up in your management plan and then referenced in your ordinance that you have strategies and practices in place that preserve and protect your urban forest against invasive pests and pathogens as well as invasive species. The other thing that I think is really important to include is a process for reviewing and managing the urban forest. And while this does not have to be specifically spelled out in the ordinance itself, again, this would be very important to include in the management plan, is that you divide the community up to manage it in a way that you can see that you can get across the entire community within a reasonable amount of time. This is the Village of Mount Prospect. This is just their 2020 tree trimming schedule, but we have communities that will divide their community into 4 or 5 different sections and then do 1/4 or 1/5 of the community every year. As far as updating their inventory, they do their pruning at the same time. They identify any dead trees or opportunities for tree planting, and then they can state, even in the ordinance, that they have the community set up to be treated over a certain period of time, and then it's locked in that the community is required to do that. Another critical aspect is another important aspect is our critical areas. So if you have conservation areas or a legacy tree program or areas such as this map would indicate, excuse me, And every community in our Chicago region has a map that identifies where they have historic oak ecosystems from pre-settlement times to current day, so that they can see where they might be interested in increasing their planting of native species and help to support that, the regeneration of those oaks and those ecosystems. But if you have legacy trees, that would be something that you would want to clearly spell out in your ordinance, and then again, identify that clearly in your management plan so that you have a way to exactly identify where those trees are located and the criteria required to protect them. Climate change is something that I think is on everybody's mind these days. Obviously, one of the things that we provide are heat maps for all of our communities and all of our Chicago wards, so they can identify easily and quickly where they could be prioritizing increased planting, and how their code will address the issues of heat and issues of flooding and some of these other things that are really based on climate, so that they're more broadly representing the community as a whole and they're addressing specific needs. And then there are resources that would be applied, provided on the ordinance and the management plan. Anytime you have contractors or developers working within your community, they should know clearly where to go to find their permits, what triggers are required for permits, and what forms they need to complete, as well as what penalties and enforcement is in place. And I'll go back to this. I think, obviously if you have an ordinance, it's great, but if you don't have the enforcement in place, it doesn't help. And so it's really critical that what regulations you do have in your ordinance, that you make sure that your community is able to enforce those and hold up what they need to be doing. Some other additional resources that would be helpful, again, are resources for residents, again, because 70% of our trees are on private land. This one is the specific resource around oak ecosystems and why we should be planting more native species in our region and why our trees need that help. This is another resource that we provide that's offered through the nursery industry as well as all of our partners. It is focused on invasive species management and what to replace those invasive species with. So again, this is a nice resource for residents that could be included in your management plan, but it's also an important part that can support your section of your ordinance that focuses on management of invasive species that are impacting your urban forest. So I guess in total what I'm saying is that we've got all of these different resources that can fall within the ordinance itself that we can put in our toolbox, but that there are other resources that help support that ordinance that we need to be focused on as well. And so we can have the basic information that we need in our ordinance, but we need to have the supporting resources in order to make that ordinance effective, and that would be utilizing our management plans, our inventories, and some of the resources that we have, recognizing that there's a broader goal at play to look at trees across the entire spectrum, not just public property trees, but public and private property trees together. So I ended a little bit early there, but I think we're okay. We probably got some questions. So thank you very much for this opportunity.